My dad demanded that I give my corneas to my blind sister. I gave him the truth instead. I drove 3 hours last Tuesday, the engine drone a dull constant against the late autumn chill. The reason for the drive was a call from my father, urgent and serious, about my younger sister Haley. She was 26, and for the last 3 years, a rare genetic condition had been steadily stealing her sight. Now she was completely blind. I thought we would discuss assistance programs, maybe a guide dog, or options for modifying her apartment. My expectation was a typical, difficult family discussion about care. Instead, I pulled up to the familiar split-level house and walked into an intervention. The living room lights were too bright. My dad, my mom, my Aunt Ruth, and Haley were already seated, waiting for me. The atmosphere was heavy, a suffocating silence that made the usual sense of my childhood home, faint dust and my mother's potpourri, feel deeply unsettling. Haley sat closest to the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression carefully blank, but her blindness was stark against the light. My father, Marcus, started the meeting without preamble, his voice low and solemn, giving the lie an instant manufactured gravitas. He explained that Haley's doctor, a new specialist, apparently, had found a potential treatment. It wasn't just a treatment, it was a miracle, something that could completely restore her vision. But there was a condition: they needed a perfectly matched donor, and they needed the corneas immediately. "We've tested everyone," Dad said, his eyes drilling into mine. "Everyone in the immediate and extended family. You were the only match, Stephen. The only one." He leaned forward, his voice gaining the cadence of a preacher delivering a sermon. "This is your chance to give your sister her life back." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I am an analyst, trained to question data and logistics, and the story didn't add up. I asked about the standard waiting list for donor corneas. People waited years, but that was the normal route. My dad instantly shot the idea down. "Haley can't wait that long. Her condition is deteriorating rapidly. The doctor said this needs to happen within the next few months, or the surgery won't even be viable." He created the manufactured emergency, the tight deadline that eliminated research and independent thought. My mom, Sarah, who had been twisting a tissue in her hands, started to cry softly. She launched into a familiar litany of Haley's suffering, how hard it had been to watch her struggle, how she lost her job as a graphic designer, how her longtime boyfriend, David, had left her, and how she barely left her apartment anymore. Haley, throughout this painful monologue, remained perfectly silent. Her passivity was chilling. She was the silent center around which all this calculated misery spun. I knew I needed time. I needed to research the procedure, understand the risks, and talk to this specialist myself. I opened my mouth, choosing my words carefully. I need time to think about this and research the procedure before I can agree to anything so massive. The temperature in the room dropped. My father's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The concerned family man vanished, replaced by the controlling patriarch I knew so well. He slammed his hand down gently on the coffee table, a small but sharp sound that carried huge threat. "There is nothing to think about, Stephen," he said, his voice flat and dangerous. "This is family. This is what siblings do for each other." He let the silence stretch, forcing me to absorb the implication. Then came the word that always cut the deepest, the one that proved he was working from a script of coercion. "You have 2 perfectly working eyes, and Haley has none. Refusing to help would be selfish beyond belief." He spat the word selfish, not as an observation, but as a weapon, as if my healthy body were communal property that I was hoarding. I looked at my sister, whose gaze was locked vaguely above my head, still utterly silent, and felt the familiar, crushing weight of guilt begin to settle over me. The weight of the word selfish, thrown with such cold precision by my father, was like an actual physical blow. It was a pressure I'd been trained to yield to since childhood. I focused on the one logical question I could still muster. "And what about my vision, Dad?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain level. "If I donate a cornea, what's the long-term impact on my sight?" My father sighed, a sound of heavy, put upon martyrdom. "The doctor assured us you'd still be able to see adequately with one eye, Stephen." Adequately. He dismissed depth perception, peripheral vision, and the simple luxury of binocular sight as if they were minor bonuses I didn't really need. He went on to describe the full, happy lives people supposedly lived with monocular vision, adding I was young and healthy enough to adapt. Aunt Ruth, who had been watching the scene with the fierce, judging gaze of a jury foreman, chimed in. "I'd give my corneas in a second if I were a match. Any decent person would. You should be grateful you even have the opportunity to help your poor sister." Her words, designed to sound supportive and virtuous, only amplified the coercion. I realized they were not asking, they were demanding a sacrifice as a non-negotiable family duty. I knew I had to push back against the speed of their manufactured crisis. I need to talk to this doctor myself, look at the surgical process, and understand the recovery time. I need to make an informed decision. My dad's face hardened further. "You are wasting time Haley doesn't have, Stephen. Every day we delay, her chances go down." That was the line that finally shifted my attention. I turned to the only person who hadn't participated in the onslaught, Haley. She was the one who was supposed to benefit, the ultimate victim, yet she remained an enigma, a passive observer in the center of the storm. Haley, I said, quietly. What do you think? She finally spoke, and her voice was thin, rehearsed, and edged with the deep sorrow they had been broadcasting. I don't want to pressure you, Stephen. Losing my sight has taken everything from me. My job, my relationship, my independence. I'm drowning. I understand if you can't do it, I really do. But I'd never forgive myself for not asking. It was brilliant. A perfect, manipulative double bind. She claimed not to pressure me while using the full weight of her tragedy to hold me emotionally hostage. My dad immediately jumped in, not allowing her subtle appeal to stand alone. It's not really asking when the answer should be obvious, he sneered. He pulled out his phone, violating the somber mood with technology, and scrolled through pictures. He showed me images of Haley from before, painting, hiking, traveling, smiling brilliantly. Then he abruptly slid to recent photos, Haley looking miserable, using her white cane in the apartment, looking lost. He looked me straight in the eye as he delivered the ultimate threat. This is your fault if you let it continue. My mother added the final layer of calculated urgency. She revealed they hadn't just spoken to the surgeon, they had scheduled tentative dates for next month. They had put down a large deposit, one they couldn't get back. They had already told Haley's friends the good news, that she'd be able to see again soon. They'd even bought her new art supplies for when she recovered. Everything was planned. Everything was set. The entire performance, the intervention, the drama, the emotional blackmail, was designed to make my immediate yes a formality, a rubber stamp on a done deal. My refusal was the only thing standing between their perfect narrative and their fabricated disaster. I felt a surge of cold panic. I stood up, needing air, needing to flee the psychological cage they had built around me. I need to leave, I said, moving toward the front door. I need to go and think. My father's large frame moved faster than I expected. He stepped in front of the door, blocking my exit completely. You are not leaving, Stephen. Not until you agree to help your sister. His voice was low and shaking with rage, the control finally cracking. He dropped the ultimate hammer, Foss. If you walked out that door, you were walking out of the family forever. I'd disown any child who could watch their siblings suffer when they had the power to fix it. Jeer, my mother rushed toward me, tears streaming down her face, grabbing my arm. Please, Stephen, just say yes! Be the hero. We'll support you through the recovery, we'll pay for everything. Just say yes! I didn't hear her. I only heard the finality of my father's threat. The terror gave way to a cold, burning clarity. The only thing worse than being in this family was being used by them. I didn't speak another word. I pulled my arm free from my mother's grasp and pushed past my father's shoulder, forcing my way out the door and into the evening air. I drove the 3 hours back to my apartment with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't face them again, not yet. I knew I needed distance and a plan. The whole drive was hell. My phone, charging in the center console, continuously buzzed and lit up. My father left 8 voicemails, each one more furious than the last, demanding to know where I went and accusing me of abandoning Haley in her time of need. By the time I crossed into my city limits, my mother had begun texting, begging me to come back so we could work this out, interspersed with texts accusing me of being cruel. I kept both hands on the wheel and didn't respond. I got home around midnight and collapsed onto my couch, the silence of my own apartment a temporary, fragile shield. I knew I couldn't move forward until I understood the weapon they had just tried to use against me. I needed to know the clinical, unvarnished truth. The stale air of my small apartment, usually depressing, felt like a clean, cold infusion into my lungs. I was alone, and for the first time in days, that was a source of power, not fear. The frantic, 3-day siege of phone calls and guilt-ridden texts from my family was the last, desperate push of the pressure campaign. It was designed to break me, to wear down my resistance until I stumbled back to their house, exhausted and apologetic, ready to agree to the sacrifice. But the constant bombardment had the opposite effect. It provided the necessary noise to block out my own internalized guilt, leaving me cold, analytical, and ready to act. My first logical step, the one my analytical mind insisted on, was to verify the medical claim. I had left their house under the ultimate threat of being disowned, all based on the promise of a revolutionary surgery. I had to know, definitively, if the cost they demanded, my sight, was even worth the price of a transaction. I blocked my parents' numbers temporarily. The immediate silence was jarring but necessary. And then I went searching for the doctor's name my father had mentioned. It took several searches to locate his official contact information. My hands were slick with cold sweat as I dialed the number, half expecting to get a recording or an unlisted clinic. Instead, a calm receptionist answered, and a few minutes later, I was speaking to Dr. Kavanagh himself. I explained the situation with careful precision, reciting the story my family had told me, the dire timeline, the immediate need for a close genetic match, the revolutionary nature of the living cornea donation for Haley's genetic condition. I waited for him to confirm the details, to validate the crisis I was supposed to be resolving. There was a long silence on the line, not the one of a busy professional, but of a person processing something deeply disturbing. "Mr. West, I am deeply sorry, but what you were told is incorrect," Dr. Kavanaugh finally said, his voice measured and professional, yet clearly horrified. "There is no revolutionary cornea surgery scheduled. Haley is on the normal transplant waiting list, like everyone else. Based on current estimates for her specific condition, she is likely to receive donor corneas within the year." My grip tightened on the phone until my knuckles turned white. The blood drained from my face, leaving me feeling hollow. "And the living donation?" I managed to ask, the words barely a whisper. "Taking corneas from me to help her specifically for this condition." "That's not how cornea transplants work for conditions like Haley's," he explained patiently. "You cannot simply take corneas from a living person for an elective procedure. The only time we would even consider it is for emergency trauma, and even then, it is extremely rare and requires extensive ethical review. No, I have never discussed living donation with your family. I would never suggest such a thing as a primary treatment option for this disorder." The core of the crisis, the central demand that had threatened to tear my family apart and cost me my sight, was a complete and utter fabrication. The entire intervention, the tears, the threats, the talk of deposits and art supplies, had been based on a lie. I thanked the doctor, hung up, and sat in my car in the quiet sanctuary of my apartment complex parking lot for 20 minutes. My hands were shaking, but my mind felt weirdly clear and cold. It was the clarity that comes after a violent impact. The fog of guilt, which had enveloped me for years and had been pumped full force into my head for the past week, evaporated. I could finally see everything without the emotional haze. I watched my phone buzz with another incoming call from my father and let it ring until it went to voicemail. I started the car and drove slowly to the nearest coffee shop, needing caffeine and access to my laptop. I immediately started researching US family manipulation tactics and RAS medical fraud. The information I found was devastatingly precise. The manufactured emergency, the emotional hostage situation, the financial investment designed to increase pressure. Everything I read described exactly what had just happened to me. I took notes for 3 straight hours, bookmarking pages on coercive control and how families pressure members into organ donation through calculated deception. My whole childhood, every sacrifice, every moment of being told I was selfish for wanting something for myself, recontextualized itself with every paragraph. The next morning, I called my best friend, asked Travis Bell. He'd known my family for years, but he wasn't close enough to be manipulated by them. His perspective was impartial. I told him the whole story, from the ambush to the call with Dr. Kavanaugh. There was a long, heavy silence on the line before Travis spoke. "So," he said, his voice flat with disbelief, "your dad tried to get you to give up an eye based on complete lies." Hearing someone else say it out loud, framing the monstrous request in plain, simple language, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. That simple observation broke the dam. I started crying for the first time since I'd left my parents' house, not because I was sad, but because I was fundamentally and irrevocably betrayed. Travis came over that afternoon with coffee and his laptop. We spent hours documenting everything, the timeline of events, the specific medical lies, what the doctor actually said, and the financial pressure tactics. He pulled up templates for documenting abuse and helped me fill them out with dates and direct quotes I could remember. "This is serious, Stephen," Travis said, looking up from the laptop. "What they did could actually be criminal fraud or coercion. You need legal advice." I looked at my phone, which showed 37 missed calls and dozens of texts from various relatives. My mom's texts alternated between begging me to return and accusing me of being cruel to Haley, while my dad's were pure, unfiltered rage about disrespect and betrayal. Aunt Ruth had even sent a long text about how disappointed my dead grandmother would be. I blocked my parents' numbers again. This time, I didn't feel guilty. Travis's simple observation echoed in my mind. Healthy families don't make you feel guilty for needing space to process lies. That simple truth was the foundation of my fragile new sanity. The lies had failed, but now the consequences began. The shock of discovery had worn off, leaving behind a cold, purposeful determination. I had the truth, and now I had to build a fortress around it. Travis's help had been crucial, but the sheer scale of my parents' deception demanded professional boundaries and legal protection. I called Dr. Kavanaugh back to ask if he would be willing to document what he told me in writing. He was incredibly kind, saying he'd been worried about me since our call. He agreed immediately, offering to provide a written statement confirming that he never discussed living cornea donation with my family, and that such a procedure was not medically viable for Haley's condition. He asked if I was safe, if my family was harassing me, and that question alone, a medical doctor worried about my safety for my own family, made the severity of the situation sink in completely. He promised the statement by the end of the business day. Next, Travis found a legal aid clinic that specialized in family coercion cases. They connected me with an attorney named Mariana Lopez. I recounted everything to her over the phone: the ambush, the threats, the doctor's revelation, and the barrage of messages. Mariana listened without judgment. She said that while prosecuting family members was complicated, what they did potentially constituted attempted medical fraud and emotional abuse. At a minimum, she advised me to document everything in case I needed a restraining order later. She offered to meet with me that week. Mariana's office, with its view of the busy downtown street, felt like a bunker. She helped me draft a cease and contact letter to my parents. It was formal, cold, and legally sounding, which felt safer than trying to have an emotional conversation they would simply twist and manipulate. The letter clearly stated that I knew the surgery was fake, that I had documentation from Haley's actual doctor, and that I needed 6 months of no contact to process their deception. We included a warning that further harassment would result in legal action, and that all future communication should go through Mariana's office. She printed it on her firm's letterhead, and we sent it certified mail so there would be proof they received it. It felt like launching a weapon, terrifying, but necessary. I was heating up leftover pasta for dinner 2 hours later when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but answered anyway because I thought it might be Mariana calling from a different line. "Hello?" I asked, my voice cautious. My dad's voice came through the speaker, quiet and controlled in that precise, chilling way that used to make my stomach drop when I was 12 and knew I was in deep trouble. "Stephen." He spoke slowly, carefully, like he was explaining a simple concept to a child who wasn't quite grasping it. "You've been listening to the wrong people. Outsiders who don't understand our family have poisoned you against us." He claimed someone must have filled my head with lies about the surgery because his child wouldn't turn their back on their sister like this. He kept asking who I had been talking to, what they had told me, why I was letting strangers destroy our family. I grabbed my phone with both hands because they were shaking. I noticed the caller identification. It was Asrant Ruth's number. He had deliberately called from her phone so I wouldn't know it was him. A petty, calculated move to bypass my block. Travis had told me to record any calls from my family, and I fumbled with my phone settings while my dad kept talking. I managed to start the recording. His tone shifted immediately, softer and sadder. He started saying how much he loved me and how family was forever, no matter what disagreements we had. He tried to inject doubt and fear. "You'll regret burning these bridges someday when you need them and find them gone." He then shifted back to the emotional abuse. "Haley is crying herself to sleep every night because her own sister has abandoned her. Your mom is devastated and can't understand how you've become so cruel." Every sentence sounded caring on the surface, but felt like a chilling warning about consequences underneath. Finally, I interrupted the practice script. "I talked to Dr. Kavanaugh," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the chaos inside me. "And I have his written statement about the surgery never being real." The line went completely silent for maybe 5 seconds. Long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then the call just ended without another word. I stood in my kitchen with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dead air. I had delivered the truth, and he had simply disconnected. The next morning, I was getting ready for work when someone knocked on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw my mother, Sarah, standing there in jeans and an old sweater. She looked smaller and more tired than I'd ever seen her. I hadn't given her my current address. I had moved since her last visit, but she must have gotten it from some old file or a relative. She called through the door that she needed to talk to me, claiming my dad didn't know she was here, that she had driven all this way just to see me. Part of me, the part that still remembered her reading to me before bed and making my favorite birthday cakes, couldn't leave her in the hallway. I stepped back and let her in, even though every article I had read screamed us not to. The ambush was on again. Letting my mother, Sarah, inside was a profound error, a momentary lapse in the rigorous boundaries I was trying to erect. She sat on my couch looking fragile and exhausted and started talking before I even sat down. "We only wanted to help Haley," she began, her voice cracking. "Maybe we got some details wrong about the surgery, but our hearts were in the right place." I felt a familiar coldness settle over me, the analytical part of my brain taking control to counter the surge of childhood pity. I had to stop the gaslighting immediately. "What details specifically did you get wrong, Mom?" I asked. She sniffled. "Well, the doctor had mentioned transplants at some point, so we thought living donation might be an option. We misunderstood the medical terminology." I pointed out that Dr. Kavanaugh said he had never discussed living donation with them at all. She switched tactics immediately, saying they must have misunderstood what he meant, that medical terminology was confusing, and they were just trying to understand Haley's options. I asked if the doctor had actually scheduled surgery dates. She admitted he hadn't, but claimed my dad had been researching surgeons who might do it. Her story kept shifting every time I asked a direct question, first claiming the surgery was real but simplified, then admitting they had misunderstood some things, and finally saying my dad had been trying to find creative solutions because the regular transplant list was taking too long. She never once said the words, "Well, I'd," or "I'm sorry." She just kept repositioning everything as a misunderstanding born from desperate parents trying to help their disabled daughter. I asked her directly, looking straight into her tear-filled eyes, if she knew the surgery wasn't real when they ambushed me at the house with the whole family present. She started crying harder, her face crumpling up as if I had struck her. She said I was being cruel and interrogating her, instead of focusing on how much Haley was suffering. She claimed she came here, hoping I would understand how scared they had been, how they had been willing to try anything, and how families were supposed to support each other through hard times. She deflected every single time I tried to bring the conversation back to whether she had known the truth. After an hour of going in circles, she finally left, saying she had tried her best and couldn't do anything more if I was determined to believe the worst about them. I sat on my couch feeling emotionally trucked over and more confused than before she had arrived. That evening, Travis came over. I walked him through the entire conversation, trying to figure out what had actually happened. He listened patiently, then pointed out the devastating simplicity of it. "She never actually answered a single question you asked, Stephen. She just cried and redirected and made you feel guilty for asking." He was right, but realizing it made me feel worse somehow. Like I hadn't just lost my father, but both parents swallowed by their own enabling dysfunction. My formal boundaries were now in place, but the family's narrative machine was still churning. 3 days later, the phone started ringing with calls from extended relatives. My cousin Jessica called asking why I had changed my mind about helping Haley after agreeing to the surgery, adding that my parents were heartbroken about the lost deposit. My uncle called the next day with a similar story, adding that I had gotten cold feet at the last minute and left Haley devastated right before her procedure date. My dad's sister called, saying she understood I was scared, but backing out after they had made all the arrangements was incredibly selfish. Each person had slightly different details, but the same basic story, where I was the villain who had promised to help, then abandoned my disabled sister. The specifics were wrong in ways that proved my parents were actively spreading a false, cohesive version of events. Nobody mentioned that the surgery had never been real. According to the new family narrative, I had enthusiastically agreed to donate my cornea. They had scheduled everything, and then I had cruelly changed my mind and disappeared. I called Mariana. We drafted emails to the relatives who seemed most reasonable, attaching Dr. Kavanaugh's written statement proving the surgery was never medically viable. I sent the documentation to about 15 family members, silently waiting to see who would actually choose evidence over the family's preferred version of history. About half never responded, just went silent. 3 cousins and 1 aunt apologized for jumping to conclusions, but 2 relatives, including my uncle, actually got angry at me for sending the emails, saying I was airing private family business to outsiders and making my parents look bad by showing the doctor's statement to everyone. My uncle said that even if the surgery details were exaggerated, my parents had been trying to help Haley, and I was being vindictive by publicly humiliating them. The truth didn't matter to them as long as it disrupted the family's comfort. The stress began affecting my work. My brain constantly replayed conversations. I'd be reviewing a report and suddenly remember my mom's face when she deflected my questions, or I'd be in a meeting and realize I hadn't heard anything for the past 5 minutes. A coworker, Aiden, stopped by my desk one afternoon. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee, and something about the way he asked, direct but concerned, made it clear he had noticed I wasn't okay. At the coffee shop, I gave him a simplified version. My family had lied about a medical emergency to manipulate me, and now they were spreading false stories. He listened without interrupting, then shared that he had gone no contact with his own family 3 years ago because of similar manipulation patterns. He offered to connect me with his therapist, as Dr. Estelle Medina, who specialized in family trauma, and wrote down her name and number on a napkin. I called Dr. Medina's office the next day. The waiting room was calm with blue walls, and when she called me back to her office, I sat down and immediately started crying before she'd even asked me anything. I asked if I was crazy or overreacting, if maybe my parents really had just misunderstood the medical situation. She asked me to walk through exactly what had happened. She listened carefully, then introduced me to the terms I had never heard before, SAS gaslighting and RAS enmeshment. She explained that gaslighting was making someone question their own reality, which was exactly what my parents were doing. She said enmeshment was when family boundaries were so blurred that individual needs got sacrificed for the family unit. I had been trained since childhood to prioritize Haley's needs over my own well-being. Suddenly, I had language for things I had felt my whole life but never been able to name. I felt a fragile sense of hope that, with her help, I could finally see myself as a person, not just a pawn in my family's relentless drama. I continued my sessions with Dr. Estelle Medina, and the language she gave me, gaslighting, enmeshment, was like a protective coating. It helped me process the barrage of accusations coming from my extended family, understanding that their anger wasn't about the truth, but about their preferred narrative being disrupted. They needed a villain, and by refusing to be their pawn, I had volunteered for the role. The situation escalated when my parents took their lies to the public sphere. 3 weeks after my mother's failed gaslighting visit, I was scrolling through social media during my lunch break. I saw a shared post from one of my mom's distant friends. It was a link to a Yar's GoFundMe campaign for Haley's medical expenses. The description made my stomach drop. It talked about Haley's struggle with blindness, mentioned a potential, time-sensitive treatment that could restore her vision, and heavily implied that unforeseen family circumstances had made it impossible to pursue the surgery. The wording was careful, never directly saying I had backed out, but anyone reading it would assume some family member had failed to help. The campaign had raised almost $3,000 in less than a week. Comments from friends and distant relatives filled the page, offering prayers and small donations, saying how terrible it was that Haley couldn't get the help she needed. They were crowdfunding based on the same calculated, malicious lies they had tried to use on me, soliciting funds from innocent people who had no idea the surgery was entirely fake. I sat in my car, staring at my phone screen, feeling sickened by the blatant, transactional cruelty of it. I immediately took screenshots of everything and texted them to Mariana and Dr. Medina, asking what I should do. Mariana called me back within an hour. Her tone was sharp and devoid of the patience she usually showed for family disputes. "This is actual fraud, Stephen, not just family manipulation," she stated firmly. "They are soliciting donations based on false medical information, which violates GoFundMe's terms and possibly state fraud laws. You have documentation from Dr. Kavanaugh proving the surgery wasn't real. You can report the campaign, and it will likely be taken down." She also warned me that reporting it would cause a massive, explosive reaction in my family. This wasn't just maintaining distance. This was actively working against them. I thought about all those people donating their money, based on the same scheme they had used to pressure me into sacrificing my body. I told Mariana I wanted to report it. Mariana helped me file the fraud report with the GoFundMe support team. I submitted Dr. Kavanaugh's written statement, the timeline of events, and screenshots of my parents' messages trying to pressure me into the fake surgery. The legal aid clinic added a letter explaining the situation from their perspective. For 6 days, nothing happened. I started wondering if GoFundMe would even care about a private family dispute. Then, the campaign disappeared from the site. Gone. I checked the link repeatedly, and it only returned a message saying it had been removed for violating community guidelines. Mariana later told me my parents had been required to refund all donations, and GoFundMe had flagged their account. My father's response came through in a furious, incoherent flood of emails, since I still had him blocked on my phone. He accused me of destroying the family's reputation, humiliating them in front of the whole community, and being vindictive and cruel. He claimed I had gone out of my way to hurt them when they were just trying to help Haley. The messages got angrier and less coherent as they went on, dissolving into raw insults and primal demands for control. My mother sent shorter messages to my email, saying she couldn't believe I would do this, that reporting them to GoFundMe was taking things too far, and that I was tearing the family apart over pride. The following Tuesday, our receptionist called my desk phone. "Stephen, someone is in the lobby asking for you. She says she's your mother." I went downstairs confused, heart hammering against my ribs. My mom stood near the entrance, looking exhausted. She didn't try to approach me when I came through the security door. She simply walked over, handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope, and left without saying a word, walking straight to her car in the parking lot. I carried it back upstairs and put it in my bag, unable to deal with whatever fresh manipulation was inside. That night, I sat on my couch and opened the envelope. Inside were 6 pages of notebook paper, covered front and back with my mother's familiar looping handwriting. It was the closest thing to honesty I would ever receive from either parent. She admitted my dad had gone too far with the surgery plan. She wrote that he was desperate to help Haley and had convinced himself the ends justified the means. She said she went along with it because keeping peace with him is how she survives their marriage. That openly disagreeing with him makes life unbearable. She knew I was angry but begged me to understand they did everything out of love for Haley. She talked about how helpless they felt, how the fake surgery seemed like a way to motivate me to help without understanding how wrong it was. She ended by saying she missed me and hoped I would come back to the family someday, that she understood if I needed time but wanted me to know she loved me. I read it twice. Then I put it back in the envelope and cried, exhausted. Not because it changed anything, but because it was so close to the truth, and yet still so far away. She explained their behavior, but never took actual responsibility or acknowledged the harm they had caused me. She explained why she chose her own comfort over my well-being. I brought the letter to my next therapy session. Dr. Medina read it carefully. She pointed out that it was an dollar's explanation, not an apology. It asked me to understand their motivation, but offered no promise of change or intention to make amends. You can have compassion for their circumstances, she said, while still protecting yourself from their behavior. My mother was trapped in her own dysfunction, but that did not obligate me to stay trapped with her. I sat there looking at the letter, and a cold, firm thought settled in my mind, the definitive truth I had fought for. My dad demanded that I give my Corneas to my blind sister. I gave him the truth instead. The explosion from the GoFundMe incident, followed by my mother's apology by explanation letter, marked the end of the psychological waiting period. I realized I couldn't wait for my family to apologize or change. I had to build my own future, one free from their constant demands. The silence I maintained was less about punishment and more about self-preservation. 4 months after the initial confrontation, I was slowly starting to sleep through the night again. I could focus at work without my mind constantly spinning through family drama. The grief still came in waves, hitting me when I'd remember a genuine moment from childhood, but it wasn't drowning me constantly anymore. I was starting to imagine a future where I was okay without them. My growth accelerated when I began to take action rooted in my experience. I started volunteering at the family rights organization Mariana worked with, specifically on their emotional support helpline. The training was 4 sessions, 2 hours each, covering how to recognize coercion tactics, what resources existed, and how to provide support without overstepping boundaries. Sitting in the training room, listening to case studies about families who used medical emergencies to manipulate members, I realized my story was not unique, it was a pattern. During the 3rd session, we practiced taking calls with role-play scenarios. I played the caller first, describing a situation where my brother needed a kidney and my parents were threatening to disown me if I didn't donate. The volunteer playing the helpline counselor validated my feelings and asked about my own health concerns. I started crying without meaning to, because nobody in my actual family had once asked about my well-being during the whole Corneas situation. The facilitator paused the exercise, and I explained that this was exactly what had happened to me, just with Corneas instead of a kidney. She nodded, saying that was precisely why peer support was so powerful. We understood from the inside what manipulation felt like. My first real shift on the helpline came 2 weeks after training. The second call was a young woman named Jessica, whose voice shook as she explained that her family wanted her to drop out of college to take care of her sick grandmother full-time. Her parents said she was being selfish by prioritizing her education over family needs. Jessica kept saying, "Maybe they are right. Maybe I am being selfish." I recognized every single manipulation tactic. I told her that caring about her education didn't make her selfish, and that she could love her grandmother and still have boundaries about her own life. I explained that guilt was a tool manipulative families used to control people, and that real love didn't require her to destroy her future to prove her loyalty. I gave her information about support groups and setting boundaries. She cried and thanked me, saying nobody had ever told her it was okay to want her own life. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment crying too, because I wished someone had said those exact words to me a year ago. I also forced myself to try something new and vulnerable in my personal life. I downloaded a dating app, partly because I was lonely and partly because I needed to practice interacting with people who didn't know anything about my family mess. I went on 3 awkward first dates in 2 weeks. The third guy, Mark, was easy to talk to. He was a software developer who liked hiking. On our second date at a Thai restaurant, he asked about my family in that casual way people do. My stomach tightened, but I gave him the line I had been practicing with Dr. Medina. We weren't close, and I didn't see them much. He just nodded and said, "That's fair. Some families are complicated," and immediately changed the subject to hiking trails. The fact that he didn't push for details or try to fix it felt completely revolutionary. It was the first green flag I had ever consciously recognized in a relationship, respect without judgment or strings attached. Meanwhile, Dr. Medina challenged me to try a closing ritual. I had been resistant, thinking it was pointless to write to people who would never read it. But something shifted after I started helping others on the helpline. I sat at my kitchen table one night with my laptop and started typing a letter to my parents that I would never send. The letter grew to 10 pages, single-spaced, saying everything I had never been able to tell them. I wrote about the childhood I deserved, where my needs mattered as much as Haley's, and where I wasn't just the healthy child who existed to support my sister. I described the relationship we could have had if they had been capable of honesty and basic respect. I listed specific memories of being overlooked, minimized, and expected to sacrifice without question. I explained how the Corneas scheme wasn't an isolated incident, but the final undeniable proof of a lifelong pattern. I sobbed through writing all of it, tears dripping onto my keyboard, my chest aching with grief for the parents who would never exist. I brought the printed letter to Travis's apartment the following weekend. He had offered to help me with the ritual. He had a fire going in his fireplace, and I stood there holding those 10 pages, feeling the final weight of my past. Travis asked if I wanted to read any of it aloud, but I shook my head. I just started feeding the pages into the flames. They curled, blackened, and my words disappeared into ash and smoke. Watching them burn felt like releasing the last fantasy that they would ever apologize or take responsibility. It was accepting that closure had to come from inside me. Travis stood next to me until the last page was gone, then handed me a beer. We sat on his couch in a quiet acceptance that some things couldn't be fixed. A few days later, my manager called me into a meeting. I assumed it was about the Henderson project I'd been leading. Instead, she offered me a promotion to senior coordinator with more responsibility and a significant pay increase. She said I had been doing excellent work and showing strong leadership. I sat there processing the offer, realizing that 6 months ago, I had been barely functional. Now I was thriving, ready to take on a challenge. I accepted the promotion and thanked her, then took myself out to a nice Italian restaurant that night to celebrate. I sat alone, feeling genuinely proud of having built a life my family couldn't touch or diminish. 6 months had passed since that horrible day at my parents' house, and the silence had finally transformed into peace. I noticed I was sleeping through the night again. I could focus at work, and I made plans with friends on weekends instead of staying home feeling depressed. The space was no longer a frantic avoidance. It was an actual, solid place to breathe. Haley's text came on a Wednesday afternoon. It said she was getting Corneas from the transplant list within the next 2 months, that her surgery was scheduled for early next month, and she wanted me to know even though I didn't care about her anymore. The final phrase was the usual, small accusation wrapped in information, a last flicker of the manipulation flame. I sat with my phone for a few minutes, then typed back that I was genuinely happy her surgery was scheduled, and wished her a smooth procedure and full recovery. I meant it. Whatever had happened between us, I didn't want her to stay blind. She read the message immediately but didn't respond. I put my phone away and went back to work. That Saturday, I met Travis for coffee. I told him I thought I was ready to move forward with my life instead of just processing the past. He asked what that looked like. I realized as I answered that I wanted to help other people dealing with family manipulation, maybe volunteer with the legal aid clinic where Mariana worked, or facilitate support groups. I wanted to take everything I had learned and use it so other people didn't feel as alone as I had. Travis smiled and said that sounded exactly right, that turning pain into purpose was how people survived things like this. Mariana sent me information about a family rights organization the following week. They needed volunteers for their helpline, and soon after, they asked if I would facilitate a new support group for young adults dealing with coercion. I panicked about whether I was qualified, but at the first meeting, sitting in that circle of 8 nervous 20-somethings, I realized I was perfectly suited. I could spot the manipulation tactics immediately because I had lived them. When a girl described her mom's guilt trips, I knew exactly what she meant. I offered practical resources and reminded them they weren't selfish for protecting themselves. Turning my worst experience into something that helped others felt like alchemy, transforming poison into medicine. January brought an unexpected email from the family rights organization. They were expanding their board of directors and wanted to know if I'd be interested in joining. Accepting felt like claiming a new identity, not just as someone who had survived family manipulation, but as someone actively working to help others do the same. My story had purpose now beyond just being something awful that happened to me. I also began to experience what a healthy relationship felt like. Terry, the man I was dating, was kind and stable. 4 months into dating, he asked about meeting my family. I paused the movie we were watching, turned to face him, and told him the whole truth. I was estranged from my parents, and it was permanent. I waited for him to get weird, to suggest I was overreacting. Instead, he simply asked what I needed from him regarding that. Did I want him to avoid the topic completely? Or was I okay discussing it? His response, someone respecting my boundaries without trying to fix or judge the situation, felt like a healing balm. 6 months after that horrible day, my cousin Sarah called with news. Haley's surgery had gone well, and she was regaining vision. But Sarah also mentioned something else. Haley had started seeing a therapist who specialized in family systems, and she had begun examining her own role in what happened. My cousin said Haley had mentioned me, acknowledging that the surgery scheme had been wrong, and that she should have questioned it more. I felt a complicated, cautious relief. I wasn't ready to reach out yet, but knowing Haley was working on herself made future reconciliation feel possible without being required. The Christmas card arrived 3 days before the holiday, forwarded from my old address. It had a generic winter scene on the front, and inside my parents had written, "Thinking of you during this special season," with both their signatures. No acknowledgement of the past 6 months, no apology, just a cheerful card like we were a normal family who had simply lost touch. I brought it to Dr. Medina. She said this was them testing whether I would rug sweep everything if they just pretended it didn't happen. I threw the card in my kitchen trash that night and didn't send anything back. The silence felt like its own kind of answer. I got the board director position and began apartment hunting, finding a one-bedroom with hardwood floors and big windows. Accepting the board role felt like the final, defiant step in my personal reclamation. Moving day was hot and chaotic, with Travis, Terry, and my support group friends showing up to help load boxes. The apartment filled with laughter and people who actually showed up when they said they would. I looked around at the laughter and the clutter, and a profound realization struck me. This, I thought, is what home feels like, a place chosen, full of people who respect and value me without conditions. I looked around at my chosen family, sitting on my new couch, celebrating my professional success and my 1-year anniversary of setting boundaries. My parents still hadn't apologized and probably never would. Some relatives still thought I was the villain who abandoned my disabled sister, and I had accepted that their opinion didn't define my reality. I would never have the family I wanted growing up, but I had the life I built, the peace I fought for, and the self-respect that came from refusing to be manipulated into giving up pieces of myself. That was enough.